Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please come in, find a seat if you can, and welcome. This is one of a series of talks organized by the Center for Law and Liberty on academic freedom and on free speech. And we are delighted to be able to have Robert Post join us here for this. He is currently the Dean of Yale Law School, so he has some experience from the administrative side. But he also happens to be a distinguished scholar of free speech and academic freedom who also has had some distinguished experience in this from a more practical point of view as a lawyer. It's a rare combination, and we are really delighted to have you here. So without further ado, he will speak probably for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I must say, I'm completely blown away by this audience, and it tells me I'm probably walking into some sandstorm of controversy, which, but thank you for coming today to hear this. I'm going to talk about the relationship between freedom of speech, which is lodged in the American Constitution, as you all know, in the First Amendment, and academic freedom. And if you asked the average professor what is the meaning of academic freedom, they would say something like it means freedom of speech, and they'd have in mind the First Amendment. I know this because for several years I was general counsel of the AAUP, which is the organization that is the repository of academic freedom, so I talked to a lot of professors about this, and I also was the drafter of the academic freedom policy for the University of California system all over the state of California, and I talked to a lot of professors, and that's the way they would think about it. And my thesis this morning is that's absolutely the wrong way to think about it. So I'm going to try to put a different picture on the table for you, and to understand why that picture that equates freedom of speech and academic freedom is misleading, to say the least. We need to go back and think about where academic freedom comes from and what it's designed to do. So if I take you back to the first half of the 19th century and think about American higher education at that time when you were King's College and there was Harvard and there was Yale, American institutions of higher education were typically religious institutions that instructed young men in character and moral truths, gave them the cultural capital necessary to be an elite, and they reproduced the cultural understandings of their society. They trained people to assume positions of leadership, which means they gave them the ethical instructions necessary. It was a quiet time in American higher education. And then after the Civil War completely changed that. And among other things, it changed that because American academics started to leave this country and go to Germany. And in Germany, institutions of higher education had taken on the job of producing new knowledge. They were devoted to something in German they called Wissenschaft, meaning kind of systematized knowledge, and they wanted to increase systematized knowledge. So there was a class of professional academics who were inventing fields like chemistry and so on. And Americans, say like William James, would go to Germany. They would see this new institution, a university, that was actually devoted to creating new knowledge, and they would come back to this country and they would look at these kind of very parochial institutions of higher education, and they would say, we have to change these entirely. We have to reorient the meaning and the mission of American higher education. And the first American university to be oriented around this new mission of establishing knowledge was Johns Hopkins University, which understood itself on the German and European model. And it was an important moment in the history of American higher education when Daniel Coit-Gilman, who was then president of Johns Hopkins, addressed the assembled officers and friends and faculty of Johns Hopkins in 1885. And he said to them, I'm quoting him now, that the functions of the university may be stated as the acquisition, conservation, refinement, and distribution of knowledge. It is the business of a university to advance knowledge. That was a total shift in what institutions of higher education in the United States were all about. In fact, you can see that in Cardinal Newman's idea of the university, the English view. He said, universities can't be about creating new knowledge, because then why would we care about students? It's about distributing knowledge already known. says Newman. But by the time this German influence comes in, it's creating new knowledge. And as a result of this shift in perspective, almost every one of you, I suspect, in this room would find banal and obvious Karl Jasper's observation, which he made in the years after World War II, that, and I'm quoting him now, the university is the corporate realization of man's basic determination to know. Its most immediate aim is to discover what there is to be known and what becomes of us through knowledge. If you look at any modern university, you will find somewhere in this mission statement the purpose of creating and distributing new knowledge. I bet if you checked Columbia, you would find something like that. And the invention of academic freedom in the United States, there was no academic freedom before the 20th century, comes directly from this shift in the mission of the university. The mission of the university changes to the creation of knowledge, and academic freedom as an ideal, as a principle, comes along with it. Now, academic freedom had previously arisen, most specifically in the German context. It begins to bubble up in 1732 with the firing of Christian Wolff by the king of Prussia. It percolates by the middle of the 19th century. It's quite established. And the Germans had reached a certain accommodation. The universities in Germany were state institutions, and professors were bureaucrats. And academic freedom was a treaty that the professors basically had signed with the state. The state said to professors, we will leave you alone to do your bureaucratic duty, which is to discover new knowledge, but the price of that is you stay out of politics. You do not get involved in matters of statecraft. You do not get involved in matters of political choice. You're in the university. You're in literally the ivory tower. And that was the notion of academic freedom that was pretty firmly entrenched in German universities. This was not an option for American professors because the American professoriate developed during the progressive era when the idea of the American expert was always an expert in the service of public ends. So some professors carried over, American professors, carried over this German idea of academic freedom. Harlan Stone, for example, who was the dean of this law school, had something like that idea and expressed something like that idea in the teens, in the second decade of the 20th century. But mostly American professors rejected that notion. And they wanted a different concept of academic freedom. And the need for academic freedom arose when the idea of the university producing knowledge collided in the United States with, let's call it, the political economy of higher education in the United States. So in Germany, professors are bureaucrats. They're state employees. They have the protection of the bureaucratic system that the bureaucratic system extends to officers of state. But in the United States, professors are employees at will. So they can be hired or fired at the discretion of those who owned the universities. And universities in the United States were owned. They were owned by the state, as the University of Wisconsin, the great public universities. They were owned by churches and parochial universities, or they were owned by private proprietors, like, for example, Leland Stanford owned Stanford University. It was his university. And those who owned universities viewed professors as their employees. And they would say, our employees should follow our direction, and if we don't like what they're saying, we can fire them. So there is no such thing as academic freedom in the United States because of the fact that professors are viewed as employees at will by those who own the university. So take a concrete example, very famous. Edward Ross was an economist, turn of the century, 1900, and he's employed by Stanford University. And Ross has heretical views. He thinks we should have the silver standard instead of the gold standard. And he thinks we shouldn't impose cheap Asian labor because we should support American unions. Right? So he's saying this in Stanford University. And at the time, Stanford University was owned by Mrs. Leland Stanford, the widow of Leland Stanford. Leland had died. And she was a formidable woman. Albie Small called her the Dowager Empress of Palo Alto. And she very strongly disapproved of these views because, of course, her empire had been built upon importing cheap Asian labor, and the gold standard was thought of as absolutely prerequisite for the health of industrialists like Leland Stanford. So in 1900, she writes David Starr Jordan, who's the president of Stanford, and she says, I don't want anyone teaching at my university with those views. Those views are inappropriate. I don't believe that they're true. Fire that man. I don't expect to see him come the fall. She writes this in May. And Jordan fires him. He says, your services are no longer required at Stanford. And this sets off a thermonuclear explosion among American professors who begin to see how can we do our job, however you define that job, if we're subject to control by those who own the universities. And they know nothing about economics. They know nothing about what wages should be paid or immigration or whether we should have a gold standard or a silver standard. They have public opinion. They're lay people, but they're controlling us. And if they control us as lay people, we can't do our jobs as those who have to develop these forms of knowledge as a matter of expertise. And this shock spreads throughout American academia. Lovejoy, who is one of the great articulators of American academic freedom, quits Stanford, the philosopher Arthur Lovejoy, and he goes to because of this. He can't bear being in a university that would treat its professors that way. And there are many other incidents like that I could describe, but the response of the American professoriate is in 1915 to develop something called the American Association of University Professors. I mentioned that earlier. And that is the organization that in the United States has defined the meaning of academic freedom. Now, academic freedom has many different, comes in many different flavors. One flavor is the constitutional law of academic freedom, and you see that when you read cases like Grutter. I'm not talking constitutional law here. I am talking about the ideals of academic freedom by which those of us in institutions of higher education decide how we're going to treat each other. How should we treat the freedom of teaching or the freedom of research or the freedom of extracurricular speech? Those are the questions I'm thinking of as a matter of ideals that we pledge allegiance to, not a matter of constitutional law that limits what the state can do. So they formed the AUP in 1915. It's a formidable organization. John Dewey is its president. And the first thing they do is to create a declaration of principles on academic freedom and academic tenure. This document is the first articulation of what academic freedom should mean in the United States. In my view, is still the greatest explication of what academic freedom means in the United States. And its understanding of what academic freedom is reaffirmed in something called the 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure, which is the foundational document for academic freedom in the United States today. It's endorsed by 180 educational organizations, and that is understood to be incorporated as a matter of contract into the bodies of law that govern most institutions of higher education in the United States. And the 1915 Declaration defines academic freedom as consisting of three components: freedom of research. You're free to research and to publish the results of your research, freedom of teaching, freedom in the classroom, and finally what it calls freedom of extramural utterance and action. And these same three components of academic freedom are repeated in the 1940 statement. Today, I don't know how much time I have, but I'll try to get through freedom of research and its relationship to freedom of speech. And if we have time in Q&A, we can talk about freedom of teaching and freedom of extracurricular speech. These are very different dimensions of academic freedom and require a distinct form of analysis. But now if we look at freedom of research, and I ask a professor, and I started out by asking, what does it mean to say you have academic freedom of research? A professor would tell you, almost 100% of the time, they would say, it's analogous to the First Amendment right to publish whatever I want to publish without fear of sanction or penalty. That would cash out the freedom of research in that way, freedom to say and research what I want without any sanction or any penalty, which is analogous to a First Amendment right. And my argument is going to be that is exactly incorrect. So let me give you an example of how it's incorrect that might make it intuitive to you the difference. So imagine that there's some young astronomer, and he's heretical, and he writes an editorial in the New York Times, and he says, you know what? We've really had it wrong all these years. The moon is made of blue cheese. First Amendment says that's his privilege. He can say what he wants. We can't penalize him, even though it's absolute nonsense. Imagine that same young astronomer coming up for tenure at Columbia, and this is his dissertation. And the astronomer might, no, actually, this is not good enough work. This is actually poor work. We're not going to tenure you. Academic freedom is entirely consistent with the astronomy department making that judgment. Indeed, it depends upon the astronomy department making that kind of judgment. And that shows you that there's going to be a fundamental difference in the way we construct these two rights. Now, there's, of course, obvious differences that those of you who know constitutional law know. First Amendment requires state action, academic freedom, and the way I'm describing it doesn't. But I want to now talk about the structure of what we're actually trying to protect, the values at the heart of these two different forms of rights. So the First Amendment is a complicated question. There are people in this room who know much more about it than I do. But you're going to have I'm just going to start now with something simple that everyone would agree with. Insofar as we have ordinary First Amendment protections, you're going to say no content discrimination. You can't penalize somebody because of the content of their speech, except in extraordinary situations. And a whole complex of things follow from that. For example, as the court said in Gertz, all ideas are equal. You can't say you have a good opinion, you have a bad opinion. All ideas are equal. You can't, the basic thought here is that, as Alexander Mickeljohn put it, there is a basic equality in the field of ideas that the First Amendment enforces. And that goes to a respect for the speakers. All the speakers have an equal right to set forth their opinion. So in public discourse and when we talk about opinions, you believe that there's climate warming, you don't believe that there's climate warming, the state has to be neutral between these ideas. Not true in academia. The whole idea of academia, which academic freedom is supposed to support, rests on the opposite premise, which is there are better ideas and worse ideas. There are ideas which gather the support of the community of scholars which, to whom you are speaking, and there are ideas which don't. So if it is the case that all ideas are equal, it can't be the case that there are true and false ideas. Academic freedom rests on the notion that, as best we can determine, there are true ideas and false ideas. See the example about the moon. Or take another basic First Amendment rule. You can't compel someone to talk. Right? I can't compel you to have a license plate that says live free or die. I can't compel you to reveal certain things about the charity that you're soliciting money for. And the basic thought here is, if I can't discriminate between what the different content of what you say, then I can't discriminate between speaking and not speaking. Your decision whether or not to speak is deserving of as much respect from the state as your decision to say X rather than Y. That's the basic structure of ordinary First Amendment doctrine. Not true in academia. I mean, publish or perish. If you don't say something, we're going to judge you. And if you don't say it correctly, we're going to judge you. So we have an entirely different structure of what it is that we're protecting. And how can we explain that? How do we define, then, the object of protection of academic freedom of research? So if we look at the 1915 Declaration, it defines academic freedom of research as the freedom to pursue the scholar's profession according to the standards of that profession. It says that, and I'm quoting it now, the liberty of the scholar within the university to set forth his conclusions, be they what they may, is conditioned by there being conclusions gained by a scholar's method and held in a scholar's spirit. That is to say, they must be the fruits of competent, patient, and sincere inquiry. And it concludes the Declaration by saying academic freedom upholds not the absolute freedom of utterance of the individual scholar, but the absolute freedom of thought, of inquiry, of discussion, and of teaching of the academic profession. So we are so used to thinking of rights as individual rights. The freedom of speech is definitely an individual right. It's my right. It's your right. Here we have the notion that it is not the right of a person individually. It's the right of a profession to determine for itself what is true, what is not, what shall be said in the name of the profession. So we have to unpack what that could possibly mean for us. We don't have that concept easily at hand, the idea of a right that is held by a profession rather than an individual person. So if I reduce it to its essence, and I have about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, really its essence, the argument that the 1915 Declaration puts on the table is that a university is not a business venture. It's not something which is controlled by its owner and therefore designed to serve the goals of its owner. Rather, the institution of the university is a public institution that serves a public trust, and that trust is in the creation and dissemination of knowledge. And when the Declaration speaks about knowledge, it's not speaking about any form of knowledge. It's not speaking about Cartesian knowledge, which I get by immediate sense impressions. I open my eyes and I know I'm facing an audience. It's not talking about the form of knowledge that is charismatic, that comes, say, from art. It's talking about a very specific form of knowledge that comes from and produced by a close-knit community of inquirers. Here, think Charles Peirce. The idea of academic freedom comes out of a Peircean notion of a community of inquiry. And community of inquiry has another name that we use now. It's called a discipline. And disciplines are united by common practices, beliefs, and methods of knowing. And disciplines produce forms of knowledge that are necessary for the modern state, let's say the state since 1900. And you can't know things without having disciplinary knowledge. I can't know the half-life of plutonium-230 simply by looking at the element. I can't know whether smoking causes cancer or not simply by taking a cigarette. I can't know whether there's climate change simply by walking outside and kind of cataloging my sense impression. To know any of these things, I need to have the equipment of a community of inquiry, an expert discipline, whether it's geology or chemistry or physics or biology, whatever it is. And the sum of these epistemological resources and methods are necessary to provide the answers to the most important questions that face us as a society today. So here's the basic difference between academic freedom and the First Amendment. First Amendment rights are individual. They apply to you. They apply to me. But academic freedom applies to a discipline, meaning a community of inquiry. Knowledge is produced by the community of inquiry, and therefore the right of the discipline is not to be judged by those outside the discipline. The most basic point about academic freedom is that I, as a professor, can only be judged by my peers, and I am judged all the time by my peers. But I cannot be judged by people who are not my peers, namely people who are not part of the discipline whom academic freedom protects. So a simple example, I, as a professor, want to publish X. My colleagues think X is a terrible idea. They don't publish it in Lancet. They don't publish it in Nature. They don't give me a grant, whatever it is. Academic freedom doesn't insulate me from the judgments in my individual point of view. Academic freedom, in fact, expects the routine judgment by my peers. It is through such methods of routine judgment that disciplines maintain their freshness, maintain their flexibility, and maintain their ability to their standards. That's how disciplines do that, and that's inconsistent with the First Amendment notion. So one, the discipline does it, but as a member of this discipline, I can't be judged by someone outside. And notice how this answers to the particular political economy of the American university. Mrs. Leland Stanford can't tell me what I should do as an economist, because she's not an economist. But the economics department can tell me whether my dissertation is good or bad. That's the distinction we're talking about. The people who provide funding to Columbia can't tell a Columbia professor what to say or not say because it's an unpopular position, and therefore we're not going to give funds, and therefore the administration tells your Columbia professor not to talk. That's bad, because that is subjecting the discipline to those outside the discipline. That's the first principle of academic freedom, and it differentiates it from the First Amendment. The second is that academic freedom is, at its root, hierarchical. That's to say, there are better and there are worse. Disciplines are required to make judgments, whereas in the First Amendment, everything is equal. Every opinion is equal to every other opinion. I believe that's because First Amendment rights ultimately are about protecting the equal right of all persons to participate as democratic, as equal before a democratic state. That's what I think the First Amendment is protecting. So you have a political equality that grounds freedom of speech normally. That political equality has no place within the epistemological ordering of a discipline. Disciplines do, however, face a difficult tension, and they all face a difficult tension. If for a discipline to grow, for a discipline to adapt to changing circumstances and changing knowledge, which comes out of sister disciplines, we have to always imagine disciplines as embedded in other disciplines. You can't do law without also knowing political science and also knowing history and so forth and so on. Different disciplines connect to each other in these ways. I have to be able to critique existing hypotheses within the discipline. That's how disciplines adapt, grow, expand, and maintain their relevance and viability in the face of changing forms of knowledge outside a different discipline. So academic freedom protects, on the one hand, something that does look like the First Amendment, which is the freedom to critique existing thoughts, methods, ideas within a discipline. That's undoubtedly part of a discipline. But on the other hand, the discipline requires the ability to set bounds on critique which is and which is not cognizable within the disciplines. Disciplines that do not encourage internal criticism risk atrophy and death. Disciplines that do not bound internal criticism risk disintegration and incoherence. So all living disciplines exist within this very unstable territory between received hierarchical practices and constant dissent. And in my judgment, we have to theorize that continuity is maintained because dissenters must first be sufficiently socialized into existing disciplinary practices so that their criticisms can be formulated in a manner that is intelligible to members of the discipline. You have to have that tension, and there's no theoretical resolution of that tension. There's no principled resolution of that tension. It's just a tension that exists in any discipline. And what the Declaration says is you have to be true to that discipline to run a university. Universities have to be free to judge, and the key concept in academic freedom is competent versus not competent. Universities have to be free to judge the competence of professors. If they can't, the universities can't be true to their trust to produce knowledge, because knowledge is only produced by competence. At the same time, universities can't produce new knowledge unless they welcome and are receptive to criticism, which the competent recognize as criticism. That is the space of academic freedom. That is a totally different space than the First Amendment. So I'm going to stop right there. And I've just talked about research, not teaching, and not other aspects of academic freedom.
Thank you very much. So I first just want to say thank you for a wonderful account of something that's not often understood, namely this corporate character of academic freedom, which protects our community from the outside, but also allows freedom necessarily from within, perhaps to be judged by the community. We're now have time for Q&A. I'd like to begin with a question, and then we'll take it from the floor. And since you're a law professor, you probably can take the questions yourself. You don't need me up here. But I'll throw out the first question, which is whether there's a risk that a corporate account of academic freedom is a little too cozy because it doesn't address the dangers of discrimination carried out by the corporate entity. And some of this traditionally, for example, was status-based discrimination, basis of race and sex, just to take two obvious examples. And that required a little bit of pressure from the outside. That didn't just get corrected from within. And then there's another sort of discrimination by the corporate body of academia, which is based on ideas. right, which is actually more difficult to measure. For example, the anti-communist fears. And today, certain fears of conservatives and libertarians, which gives us a remarkably homogenous academic community. So that requires another sort of analysis. I'd be interested to hear what you say about that.
So, of course, any theory that that accepts authoritative community is going to run the danger that the power of the community is going to be abused. That's intrinsic in the notion that there's a community which carries authority within the community. What we notice less is the danger of kind of antinomy and disintegration, and say every dissenter gets to be privileged with the community. So I'll just give you a concrete example of what that looks like. I used to be the chair of the Academic Freedom Committee at Berkeley. It is a true case. Somebody came to me from a department and said his academic freedom was being violated. Why is your academic freedom being violated? Because my department doesn't let people major in me. My work is such a Kuhnian paradigm shifter that they cannot take courses in other people. I've changed the whole method of the department, and therefore students have to be free to major in me in order to get an adequate education. That was the claim before. Now, of course, everyone can claim to be a paradigm shifter, but as Bernard Williams says in his book on this subject, in point of fact, you have to pay your money and take your risk. 99.99% of the time, they're not paradigm shifters. They just want to be a paradigm shifter, and you make your judgment. And you make your judgment as best you can with as much humility as you can, because you know that the bias is always going to be a bias of inertia, of reproducing yourself, of reproducing what you look like, both in terms of racial and ethnic and gender compositions, and reproducing yourself in terms of the ideas that you find to be both palatable and compelling. You have to understand that about yourself when you're in a discipline, and then disciplines always fail in that regard. But here is where we have some saving graces. David Hollinger, who's written a lot on this subject, shows how in universities disciplines are nested. So when I would be at Berkeley, I was on a committee called the Budget Committee, and we would decide who to hire, who to give tenure to, etc. And you would get evaluations, and you would always watch how what the historians would say about this economist, or what the biologist would say about this microbiologist. There are many, many connections between disciplines, and disciplines have to maintain credibility, not only to those inside, but to those neighboring ones, and you get a set of concentric circles which have more or less relevance to the discipline. So there are ways out of this which are socially constructed in the way in which we make universities. It's not the way Germans make universities, because of the German sense of a professor is they're the head of their office. Their office exists in isolation from every other office. No one is answerable once you become a professor in a German university. Whereas here, because you're answerable to the corporate idea of the discipline, and because these disciplines are constantly overlapping with other ones, you get a lot of checks and balances, which are either by design or by happenstance, counter forces to what you're describing. But what you're putting on the table is a real danger. You can't answer that danger by simply saying ignore it, and therefore go only to the individual, because then you don't have a discipline. So you're going to have to be in some harsh space where there's no algorithmic answer.
Ready to turn something on? No, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask
Question is whether everyone else can.
I wanted to ask about, you talked mainly about the inside and outside world.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask about
whether you think the model that you described, academic freedom, contemplated competition between the disciplines as part of it. It seems to me, just empirically speaking, that often disciplines will be interested in the same thing. Let's say human behavior, want to explain it, feel that they do a better job than another discipline, seek to destroy the other discipline. It also seems that, or embarrass them or something. It also seems that some disciplines, probably art, law, for example, behaves either opportunistically or intelligently, and seeing that one discipline doesn't seem to be achieving much, or maybe they've gone down some route. Let's say economists are too mathematical, and so they rush into these voids and sort of take over what was formerly their territory. And I just wanted to see if you thought that was part of the mission of academic freedom, or in contradiction with the theory of because we're not, we maybe are somewhat answerable, but not really answerable to the history department when we write legal history. You can sort of pay attention if you want, or you can ignore it without any real consequences.
So I think the answer is yes. I think we created, I'm a pragmatist, so my view is you create a discipline to answer to a need in the world. And is the discipline answering to that need or not adequately? And that's going to tell you a lot about whether that discipline survives, whether we continue to subsidize it by hiring professors in it, and so forth and so on. This is a little different in the humanities than it is in the regular sciences or the social sciences, because what counts as a need in the humanities is different, and that's a subject we could talk about a lot. But so, for example, in the social sciences, economic premises and reasoning have been imperial in the social sciences, as distinct from disciplines like sociology that would begin, say, with the premise of socialization. If you begin with a premise of socialization, it's entirely endogenous. You don't have an economic perspective. It's very hard to do. So you watch how, at the level of basic premises, different disciplines become more or less attractive. I think the economics perspective has become hegemonic because it allows for a form of expertise that is sellable in the world. You know, people want to hire someone, if I can give you a definite answer, plus or minus 2, and you feel like you have something. People don't want to make the effort to go underneath and see whether you do. But you do raise another question, which is interdisciplinarity. And one way to theorize interdisciplinarity is the idea that often the problem that you're working on can't be solved with the tools of one discipline. You see this a lot in sciences. You see the creation of new discipline in sciences rather routinely when the methods of studying this problem require negotiation between the methods of existing disciplines and the creation of new methods. And so if what you know depends on how you know it, which is something I would accept, then if you know it in different ways, you have different tools, different mathematical premises, you're going to be creating a new discipline pretty soon. And you see that, you see the creation of rather regularly in the sciences as distinct from the humanities. The interesting thing in the humanities is you've had an effort to create new disciplines in the humanities, like women's studies or whatever, and they've been almost uniformly unsuccessful as disciplines. People in women's studies departments will always complain that they are, this is a quote that you'll see, disciplined by the disciplines. So they'll hire people who have a PhD in history or a PhD in English or a PhD in something like that. They will not themselves become the creator and the trainer of a new discipline. And one question is why? And I suspect that the answer is that what humanities do by way of contributing to our knowledge has to do with what Habermas would call a hermeneutic interest in knowing the other. They allow us to know the other in different sorts of ways, and there's only so many different ways we can know each other. Whereas in the sciences, there are an infinite number of ways we can know the physical world. And so we can have many different, whereas it comes down to anthropological ways of knowing or textual ways of knowing or, like that. And it's much more stable, the disciplinary structure in the humanities than elsewhere.
I don't know if that was intentional, that plus or minus 2 was a reference to that George Armitage Miller paper.
Absolutely not.
It's one of the most cited papers. Magic number 5 plus or minus 2.
Oh, really? Well, you see.
But I almost apologize for asking this question, but last fall, Rashid Khalidi, who I believe is the chair of the history department here, sponsored a talk. Well, he didn't sponsor, but he started an intro to talk by this guy, Steve Saleta, who was denied. They gave him a 10-year job at the University of Illinois.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a controversial topic, so I feel sort of bad about even asking about this, but I was wondering if you would be willing to tell me tell us what you think about that, and in general, what you think of sort of the influence of Israel. Because there was another woman who had a struggle to get tenure at Barnard, Nadia Abu El-Haj at Barnard, and a lot of people blame this on the Israel special interest. And I was wondering what you thought the Israel special interest influence was on academic freedom and these like little incidents.
Well, I'm not going to speak about the Israel stuff. I have no knowledge of it one way or the other. But I can speak about the incident you're describing it seems orthogonal to what I've been talking about, because it's ultimately not about the functioning of faculty in a university. It's not about anyone's teaching. It's not about anyone's research. It's not about the ability of a professor to speak out. So it is not the same thing as the classic issues which gave rise to academic freedom. So one question that the incident you're describing raises is, in what sense does it involve academic freedom at all? And so the question, I take it, would be, I'm a professor and I have the right to invite anyone to my class, was it, or to a what? And that is connected to my academic freedom. That would be the claim?
No, they offered him tenure. They gave him a tenure.
I'm not talking about Saleda. I thought you were talking about this incident here. No, you want to talk about the Saleda?
No, the Saleda.
Okay, let's talk about Saleda. All right, so the Saleda issue is a different issue. Saleda is, they're hiring somebody. There's a question of whether he was given an offer. But on questions of contract reliance, the rule was that he had been given an offer. He had resigned his old position. So he had been given an offer, and then that offer had been rejected by the trustees of the University of Illinois. And the question is, on what ground was that offer rescinded? And the answer, the best answer anyone could see from the evidence was that they didn't like his political views. Now, remember I said that academic freedom meant, if it meant anything at all, the core meaning is not that you cannot be judged, but you cannot be judged on grounds that are irrelevant to your academic competence. No one made the case that there was a judgment based on academic competence in this case, so it was a plain violation of academic freedom. The report by the local Committee on Academic Freedom at the University of Illinois said these tweets that this person, Saleda, had issued it did call into question his academic competence, because it showed that he didn't understand subject that he was going to teach. But no one picked that up. No one was willing to run with that argument. So the whole frame of the question was, is it enough to justify the firing of a tenured professor that his views are controversial? Answer, without any ambiguity, no.
Thanks.
You're welcome. How are you?
And there's so much more you could say on these topics, and so I wanted to invite you to say a little bit about whether how students' interests relate to the concept of academic freedom, either as somewhat kind of rights holders, or at least being in a community governed by a particular norm.
Yes. So in Germany, in the German concept of academic freedom, there was something called Lehrfreiheit, which went to the faculty, and Lernfreiheit, which went to the students. When academic freedom transferred to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, we dropped the Lernfreiheit. So there has never been in the United States a coherent account of student academic freedom. And the best that I've seen are saying that students have the academic freedom to make sure that professors do what they should do. So we said professors can do this, they can't do this. The professor does what he can't do. It's the student's academic freedom to enforce it. That's not a very robust idea of academic freedom on anybody's account. And so we actually do not have a conceptual apparatus that informs this question in any very helpful ways. We have a lot of notions of professorial, and then this is in the classroom, malfeasance, nonfeasance, norms of respect, norms of speaking in certain sorts of ways. But this is all defined by reference to what a well-behaved professor should or shouldn't do. And once again, the student's right is to enforce what we're saying the professor should and shouldn't do. So I haven't seen it, and I myself haven't theorized it. But it is a good project for this time and place to think about that. When you see codes of student academic freedom, they tend to come out of a university. In the German university, it was basically the students who ran it before it became a state institution. It comes out of the Middle Ages. The students would hire the professors, etc., and they retained from this ancient history the right to I have a right to a class in this, or I have a right to drop my class here. And that came from the notion that originally universities were students who hired professors. And somehow or other that persisted into this notion.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I want to talk about something a little more subtle, and that is the atmospherics. I'm a psychiatrist up at the medical center. I see students, and often I have gotten complaints from students who are, as was mentioned before, conservative or libertarian, saying that they actually are uncomfortable at this university and at many others, speaking their mind in class. Not because it's not even worked. It's a kind of a baseline atmospherics. There's a sense that certain political opinions are shunned socially. And on the other hand, if we go to Liberty University, right, I think one would be very uncomfortable. Right? So it seems to me what's happened is that there's been political separation. I wonder if you talk about that. It seems very dangerous.
You might even call that partisanship. That's a great word. So, I mean, I see that everyone sees the same complaints, but I analyze this anthropologically. I would say in any institution there'll be in-groups and out-groups, and the people in the out-groups are going to feel terrible. And now we translate this into a legal question, namely, what can we do about that? Right? So I think, myself, when I teach, I try to create a space in which people from any view feel safe to talk about it and can talk about it. How you enforce such a thing is a different matter. How you enforce such a thing in the atmospherics of a school where people have conversations inside and outside the classroom, and what you don't want to do is to be policing what people say outside the classroom, I haven't a clue. You know, I think that the cure there would be worse than the disease. So I think that's a generic problem in any institution where you have large numbers of people and where you have beliefs that are strongly held and predominant, people who are outside. And I think we who try to shape the educational environment of universities have a job, which is to try and, to the extent that we can, and without making it worse, make it safe for students of any point of view to be able to explore them with others. I do think there are limits, because I do think these are topics about which people feel passionate, you know. Kendall. How are you, Kendall?
Your talk is a talk in which the idea of disciplines and disciplinarity seems to be doing the most amount of work.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how the theory would respond to the claim made not on the basis of identity, but on the basis of positionality in the following situation. Let's take a faculty member, Ms. Organic Intellectual, and she understands her job in the university as a translation function. Part of it is to communicate to people who are formally trained in the discipline, but part of it is to represent people who are not part of the discipline, whom she sees as her intellectual constituency, the community from which she comes. Let's call it Harlem. Now, what space, if any, in your account of academic freedom is there for this constituency, most of which is not formally a part of the community of discourse that defines itself in disciplinary terms, but whom Ms. Organic Intellectual sees herself as translating the subjugated knowledges, experiences, etc., in ways that authorize their experience, authorize their knowledges, and arguably in ways in which she ought to be being accountable not only to the discipline, but to that constituency. What would you say to that claim by the community that we have a voice or ought to have a voice too in evaluating the value, competence, etc. of Ms. Organic?
Well, I mean, the first point is, insofar, I mean, you've postulated her as having a sort of dual loyalty to the discipline and to the community. Insofar as the loyalties to the community, I mean, to the discipline is just what I've been saying. Insofar as it's to the community, it's exactly what academic freedom was postulated, was created to prevent. Because the community, say, to which the trustees viewed professors as answerable, typically were conservative constituencies, and academic freedom is to cut off community control over the discipline, to create the autonomy of the discipline from the community. Now, if she wants to be responsive, that's entirely within her determination. To hold her as being responsive would be to subordinate the discipline to the political mission, and that would be viewed as inconsistent. to allow the community to control the university, which is to say to subordinate the discipline to the political, would also be viewed as an essential violation. So a simple example would be, if you're in the South, constituent communities who feel conservative and isolated, say, are Baptist fundamentalists who say the whole world is running against us. So we want to make the biology department responsive to us. If they're going to teach evolution, they have to teach creationism too. And a university would say you have to teach both because your responsibility is also to the local would be viewed as violating the academic freedom of the professor.
Just say a word because I think a very interesting conversation is evolving here. And since not all of the students may be fully keyed into what's at stake here, I just want to, if you don't mind, I'd just like to observe what's going on. Robert has put forward a view which I suppose one could snarkily call it AAUP originalism, but I think more seriously should be called a corporate vision of academic freedom, which developed at the beginning of the 20th century in response to a series of problems that were threatening the freedom of academics. But since then, there's evolved a whole series of issues involving exclusion, for example, on grounds of thought, which intersect, obviously, this disciplinarity, be it anti-communism or fears of libertarians and conservatives and so forth. And the question is whether a vision of academic freedom that developed in response to one set of problems is also sufficient to deal with a host of other problems that several of us have asked about. And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't want to interject an opinion here, but I think we should recognize that what's going on here are really fundamental questions about what the nature of this freedom is. And that's why freedom of speech is brought in as a word to redress the balance, because some people fear that this originalism or this corporatism doesn't do the trick. And I think recent events at Yale actually illustrate some of the tensions you're talking about. I don't know if you want to address those, but you know more about that than anyone here.
Well, I want to reformulate your I would say what's at stake here is power knowledge. I want to say what's at stake here is a separation of the sphere of power on the one hand, which is the political, and the sphere of knowledge on the other hand. And if what we want is to say that the sphere of power, which is to say whoever is politically dominant or able to make a claim on the loyalty of professors can control what professors do, you have subordinated the sphere of knowledge production to the sphere of power. And if you take, I would put myself in this regard in the tradition of, not of AUP originalism, but a classic like liberalism of a French political theorist named Claude Lefort, who said, what is totalitarianism? Totalitarianism is when the sphere of power and the sphere of knowledge collapse so that the people who control the political system can tell you what's true, what's not true. And think here of Soviet biology. Do you know Lysenko? Do you know the story of Maxim Lysenko? Right, Lysenko is a biologist, and he understands Marxism. So he reaches the conclusion that Marx teaches us everything has to be environmental. That is to say, there can be no genes. And Stalin loves this view of biology, so he puts Lysenko in charge of the creation of Soviet biology, sets it back 3 decades, because there's no genetics in the Soviet Union, because that contradicts what we know politically from Marxism has to be true. I think if you allow power to control if you don't have a separation, if you allow the state, or in any of its forms, to control what we do and don't know, you have basically created an Orwellian situation. And that's a very seriously difficult problem. And I would say that's the stakes to me, not AUP originalism. Jeremy.
So, I'm sure you've gotten this question before, you know it's coming, but there are obviously lots of people who resist the premise that there is such a separation between power and knowledge within the disciplines. And to take the example of the natural sciences, where you might think, at least, that this is actually where it's often been written most about. So in the natural sciences, a number of critics of Kuhn's model of paradigms, which I think your sort of disciplinary model has a lot of relationship to, this idea of autonomous disciplines. A number of critics of Kuhn have pointed out that social science disciplines are not autonomous knowledge incubators, but have funding sources. Increasingly, those funding sources are largely governmental. If not, they're private boards that have governmental connections. And very particular sort of knowledge agendas are being driven by those funding streams, which in turn are being driven by political choices. So this is just sort of a realist challenge to
No, I don't view it as a challenge. I think it's absolutely true what you're saying. Now, the question is, normatively, what do you want to do about that? I mean, of course nothing is in the real world not interdependent with other things. Of course it's influenced by this. So, for example, when in the 1950s, Berkeley made a rule saying you could not publish articles based on classified experiments, which couldn't be made public. You couldn't get tenure for work done in a classified way. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right? Is it a good thing or a bad thing if, for example, one argues that if you're going to take Title VI funding for area studies, they can't put conditions on what you can or can't have in your Middle East? Is that good or bad? Under your legal, it's like, who cares, because it's all dependent. I don't think it's all dependent. I think we have a normative position here we want to encourage in a world in which, yes, of course there are these counter-influences, and do we want to just submit to and say normatively it would be a good thing to submit professors to the control of those with political clout, or do we want to say, to the extent we can, we should, and in every little way that lawyers do, insulate it? I think those are the stakes. John?
Let me ask a slightly different question about the nature of the discipline and your views on it. If you look at some of the disciplines as being and evolving into extraordinarily dogmatic disciplines, where you don't do a certain type of work, you're almost excluded, and are defined as not competent.
Right.
And you look at cases, many of them from the biological and physical sciences, of people who would advance knowledge very rapidly, have they been included more rapidly into the disciplinary framework. You have a tension between protecting the disciplines and the professoriate from the powers that be that are external that you mentioned, but also slowing down the growth of knowledge. So if you take Stanley Prusner, for example, who proposes that there's a third cause of disease, prions, and this has not been widely accepted beyond those who are skeptical about viruses and bacteria, he's held totally outside of the existing discipline. If you look at economics today, there's such dogmatism within the field that anyone who has very different views has a very difficult time getting those views even discussed in an open way. What is your response to severe disciplinarity in the sense that it becomes
atrophied disciplinarity is, I think, what you're describing. So, yeah, you know as well as I know that in any university governance, you're going to have departments you're going to put into receivership, right? So we can have departments which are incapable of doing that, and then you and I both know that from the perspective of other disciplines, there are going to be some disciplines that seem to be so orthodox and hidebound that they're almost dead. And that's the role of university leadership, is to make those difficult judgments. But it's a difficult judgment because you are actually not an expert. You don't know whether prions are not, and I wouldn't know. So how do you decide whether to intervene? And that's the delicacy. And that's why I'm saying from the beginning, there's no algorithmic answer. There's no mechanical answer here. It's just a matter of leadership and good judgment that's going to free it up or not at the university level, which you know far better than I how to do.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.